Return of the Sorcerer by Clark Ashton Smith. And so we continue. It was almost a relief when my employer summoned me to his study. Entering, I noticed that the air was full of a pungent, aromatic smell, and was touched with the vanishing coils of a blue vapor, as if from the burning of oriental gums and spices in the church censers. An Ispahan rug had been moved from its position near the wall to the center of the room, but it was not sufficient to cover entirely a curving violet mark that suggested the drawing of a magic circle on the floor. No doubt Carnby had been performing some sort of incantation, and I thought of the awesome formula I had translated at his request. However, he did not offer any explanation to what he had been doing. His manner had changed remarkably, and was more controlled and confident than at any former time. In a fashion almost businesslike, he laid before me a pile of manuscript, which he wanted me to type for him. The familiar click of the keys aided me somewhat in dismissing my apprehensions of vague evil, and I could almost smile at the recherche and terrific information comprised in my employer's notes, which dealt mainly with formulae for the acquisition of unlawful power. But still, beneath my reassurance, there was a vague, lingering disquietude. Evening came, and after our meal we returned again to the study. There was a tenseness in Carnby's manner now, as if he were eagerly awaiting the result of some hidden test. I went on with my work, but some of his emotion communicated itself to me, and ever and anon I caught myself in an attitude of strained listening. At last, above the click of the keys, I heard the peculiar slithering in the hall. Carnby heard it too, and his confident look had utterly vanished, giving place to the most pitiable fear. The sound drew nearer, and was followed by a dull, dragging noise, and then by more sounds of an undefinable slithering and scuttling nature that varied in loudness. The hall was seemingly full of them, as if a whole army of rats were hauling some carrion booty along the floor. And yet, no rodent or number of rodents could have made such sounds, or could have moved anything so heavy as the object which came behind the rest. There was something in the character of those noises, something without name or definition, which caused a slowly creeping chill to invade my spine. Good Lord, what is all that racket? I cried. The rats, I tell you. It's only the rats. Carnby's voice was a high, hysterical shriek. Obviously not just the rats, but there's sounds and smells and such that people may experience as a spiritual experience, or even a psychic experience, that's not transmitted on the physical plane. Although, we may sense and interpret it through that. A moment later, there came an unmistakable knocking at the door near the sill. At the same time, I heard a heavy thudding in the locked cupboard at the further end of the room. Carnby had been standing erect, but now he sank limply into a chair. His features were ashen, and his look was almost maniacal with fright. The nightmare doubt and tension became unbearable, and I ran to the door and flung it open, in spite of a frantic remonstrance from my employer. I had no idea what I should find as I stepped across the still into the dim-lit hall. When I looked down and saw the thing on which I had almost trodden, my feeling was one of sick amazement and actual nausea. It was a human hand which had been severed at the wrist, a bony bluish hand like that of a week-old corpse, with garden mold on the fingers and under the long nails. The damnable thing had moved, It had drawn back to avoid me and was crawling along the passage somewhat in the manner of a crab. And following it with my gaze, I saw that there were other things beyond it, one of which I recognized as a man's foot and another as a forearm. I dared not look at the rest. All were moving slowly, hideously away, in a charnel procession, and I cannot describe the fashion in which they moved. Their individual vitality was horrifying beyond endurance, and it was more than vitality of life, yet the air was laden with a carrion taint. I averted my eyes and stepped back into Carnaby's room, closing the door behind me with a shaking hand. Carnaby was at my side with the key, which he turned in the lock, with palsy-stricken fingers that had become as feeble as those of an old man. "You saw them?" he asked in a dry, quavering whisper. "In God's name, what does it all mean?" I cried. Carnaby went back to his chair, tottering a little with weakness. His lineaments were agonizing by the gnawing of some inward horror, and he shook visibly like an ague patient. I sat down in a chair beside him, and he began to stammer forth his unbelievable confession, half incoherently, with inconsequential mouthings, and many breaks and pauses. He is stronger than I am, even in death, even with his body dismembered by the surgeon's knife, and saw that I used. I thought he could not return after that, after I had buried the portions in a dozen different places in the cellar, beneath the shrubs, at the foot of the ivy veins. But the Necronomicon is right, and Helman Carnby knew it. He warned me before I killed him. He told me he could return, even in that condition. Now, no matter how sinister someone's religion is, just don't kill them because they're practicing some faith that, okay, if they're killing people or something, but, or, to defend yourself and others, basically. No vigilante justice here. Well, this is a sort of, he grew up in a Christian culture where people are like, oh, we hope we can kill the sorcerers and stuff again. It's like, no, don't. But I did not believe him, and I hated Hellman, and he hated me, too. He had attained to higher power and knowledge, and was more favored by the Dark Ones than I, and that was why I killed him. My own twin brother, and my brother in the service of Satan, and those who were before Satan. We had studied together for many years, and we had celebrated the Black Mass together, and were attended by the same familiars. But Helman Carnby had gone... Helman Carnby had gone deeper into the occult, into the forbidden, where I could not follow him. I feared him, and I could not endure his supremacy. Yeah, that totally unjustified. It is more than a week. It is 10 days since I did the deed, but Hellman, or some part of him, has returned every night. God, his accursed hands, crawling on the floor, his feet, his arms, the segments of his legs, climbing the stairs in some unmentionable way to haunt me. Christ, his awful body, torso, lying in wait. I tell you, his hands have come, even by day, to tap and fumble at my door, and I have stumbled over his arms in the dark. See, his whole problem is that Christianity has left him, his version of Christianity left him with an idea. Well, I mean, this is how the story is being portrayed. That his version of Christianity left him with a certain idea and of what Satanism would be, and so he definitely got into some stuff as a result. Well, I mean, this is fiction, but Oh God, I shall go mad with the awfulness of it, but he wants me to go mad. He wants to torture me till my brain gives way, and that is why he haunts me in this piecemeal fashion. He could end it all at any time. With the demoniacal power that is his, he could reknit his sundered limbs and body, and slay me as I slew him. How carefully I buried the parts. With what infinite forethought, and how useless it was. I buried the saw and the knife too, at the further end of the garden, as far away as possible from his evil, itching hands. But I did not bury the head with the other pieces. I kept it in that cupboard at the end of my room. Sometimes I have heard it moving there, as you heard it a while ago. But he does not need the head. His will is elsewhere and can work intelligently through all his members. Of course, I locked all the doors and windows at night when I found that he was coming back, but it made no difference. I have tried to exorcise him with the appropriate incantations with all those that I knew. Today I tried that sovereign formula from the Necronomicon which you translated for me. I got you here to translate it. Also, I could no longer bear to be alone, and I thought that it might help if there was someone else in the house. That formula was my last hope. I thought it would help him, it would hold him. It is a most ancient and most dreadful incantation, but as you've seen, it is useless. Well, perhaps it's not his brother at all. In this sort of case, I would say it's not your brother at all. It's the same spiritual forces you've opened yourself up to and gave power in your life. His voice trailed off in a broken mumble, and he sat staring before him with sightless, intolerable eyes, in which I saw the beginning flare of madness, and I could say nothing. The confession had made was so ineffably atrocious. The moral shock and the ghastly supernatural horror had almost stupefied me. My sensibilities were stunned, and it was not till I had begun to recover myself that I felt the irresistible surge of a flood of loathing for the man beside me. I rose to my feet. The house had grown very silent, as if the macabre and charnel army of beleaguerment had now retired to its various graves. Carnby had left the key in the lock, and I went to the door and turned it quickly. "Are you leaving? Don't go," Carnby begged in a voice that was tremulous with alarm, as I stood with my hand on the doorknob. "Yes, I'm going," I said coldly. "I'm resigning my position right now, and I intend to pack my belongings and leave your house with as little delay as possible." I opened the door and went out, refusing to listen to the arguments and pleadings for protestations he'd begun to babble. For the nonce, I preferred to face whatever might lurk in the gloomy passage, no matter how loathsome and terrifying, rather than to endure any longer the society of John Carnby. The hall was empty, but I shuddered with the repulsion at the memory of what I had seen. As I hastened to my room, I think I should have screamed aloud at the least sound or movement in the shadows. I began to pack my valise with a fling of the most frantic urgency and compulsion. It seemed to me that I could not escape soon enough from that house of abominable secrets, over which hung an atmosphere of smothering menace. I made mistakes in my haste. I stumbled over chairs, and my brain and fingers grew numb with a paralyzing dread. I had almost finished my task when I heard the sound of slow, measured footsteps coming up the stairs. I knew that it was not Carnby, for he had locked himself immediately in his room when I had left. I felt sure nothing could have tempted him to emerge anyway. He could hardly have gone downstairs without my hearing him. The footsteps came to the top landing and went past my door along the hall with that same monotonous repetition, regular as the movement of a machine. Certainly it was not the soft, nervous tread of John Carnby. Who then could it be? My blood still in my veins, I dared not finish the speculation that arose in my mind. The steps passed. The steps paused, and I knew that they had reached the door of Carnby's room. There followed an interval in which I could scarcely breathe, and then I heard an awful crashing and shattering noise, and above it, the soaring scream of a man in the uttermost extremity of fear. One of the things that some of the demons have is they expect, that they have far more respect for somebody who's going to be brave and all this stuff. If you're just quivering and cowering and, then they may have even more power. I was powerless to move, as if an unseen iron hand had reached forth to restrain me. And I have no idea how long I waited and listened. The scream had fallen away in a swift silence, and I heard nothing now except a low, peculiar, recurrent sound in which my brain refused to identify. It was not my own volition, but a stronger will than mine, which drew me forth at last and impelled me down the hall to Carnby's study. I felt the presence of that will as an overpowering, superhuman thing, a demoniac force, a malign mesmerism, The door of the study had been broken in and was hanging by one hinge. It was splintered as by the impact of more than mortal strength. A light was still burning in the room, and the unmentionable sound I had been hearing ceased as I neared the threshold. It was followed by an evil utter stillness. Again I paused and could go no further, but this time it was something other than the hellish, all-pervading magnetism that petrified my limbs and arrested me before the sill. Peering into the room, in the lamp, I saw one end the oriental rug and the gruesome outlines of a monstrous, unmoving shadow that fell beyond it on the floor. Huge, elongated, misshapen, the shadow was seemingly cast by the arms and torso of a naked man who stooped forward with a surgeon's saw in his hand. Its monstrosity lay in this: though the shoulders, chest, abdomen, and arms were all clearly distinguishable, the shadow was headless and appeared to terminate in an abruptly severed neck. It was impossible, considering the relative position, for the head to have been concealed from sight through any matter of foreshadowing. Deer over there. This book doesn't mention deer. I waited, powerless to enter or withdraw. The blood had flowed back upon my heart in an ice-thick tide, and though was frozen in my brain an interval of termless horror. And then from the hidden end of Carnby's room, from the direction of the locked cupboard, there came a fearsome and violent crash, and the sound of splintering wood and winding hinges, followed by the sinister, dismal thud of an unknown object striking the floor. Again there was silence, a silence of consummated evil, brooding above its unnameable triumph. The shadow had not stirred. There was a hideous contemplation in his attitude, and the saw was still held in its poising hand, as if above a completed task. Another interval, and then without warning I witnessed the awful and unexplainable disintegration of the shadow, which seemed to break gently and easily into many different shadows, ere it faded from view. I hesitated to describe the manner or specify the places in which this singular disruption, this manifold cleavage occurred. Simultaneously I heard the muffled clatter of a metallic implement on the Persian rug, and a sound that was not of a single body, but of many bodies falling. Once more there was silence, a silence of some nocturnal cemetery, when grave-diggers and ghouls are done with their macabre toil, and the dead alone remain. I don't believe in that spiritual entities that aren't incarnate can hurt us without a permission. Drawn by the baleful mesmerism, like a somnambulist led by an unseen demon, I entered the room. I knew with a loathly prescience the sight that awaited me beyond the sill, a double heap of human segments, some of them fresh and bloody, and others already blue with beginning putrefaction and marked with earth stains that were mingled in abhorrent confusion on the rug. A reddened knife and saw were protruding from the pile, and a little to one side, between the rug and the open cupboard with its shattered door, there reposed a human head that was fronting the other remnants in an upright posture. It was in the same condition of incipient decay as the body to which it belonged, but I swear that I saw the fading of a malignant exultation from its features as I entered. Even with the marks of corruption upon them, the lineaments bore a manifest likeness to those of John Carnby, and plainly they could belong only to a twin brother. The frightful inferences that smothered my brain with their black and clammy cloud are not to be written here. The horror which I beheld, and the greater horror which I surmised, would have been to shame hell's foulest enormities in their frozen pits. There was but one mitigation and one mercy. I was compelled to gaze only for a few instants on that intolerable scene. Then, all at once, I felt that something had withdrawn from the room. The malign spell was broken, and the overpowering volition that had held me captive was gone. It had released me now, even as it had released the dismembered corpse of Helman Carnby. I was free to go, and I fled from the ghastly chamber and ran headlong through an unlit house into the outer darkness of the night.